Hello and welcome to another episode of 1000 Actually Fun Books, where we do book reviews, and today we're reviewing the book The Grand Sophy by Georgette Heyer. And we're reviewing this book as a romance, although honestly, reading it, it does not have the same feel as a modern romance. This almost comes across as historical fiction comedy. Much more so than it would be where you would label it as a romance. I'll talk about that more as I get along, but technically it's a Regency romance. It was written in the 1950s, and Georgette Heyer is considered one of the leading proponents, I guess, of creating the modern romance genre. Now, obviously, she's not the first to create a romance novel. Most people attributed that to Jane Austen, but this feels very similar to Jane Austen in the way the language works, in the setting, in the tone of the romance, everything about that. So if you like the idea of like a very, I wouldn't say sedate, but a very, regal kind of setting romance where everybody's very old-fashioned and very honorable, chivalrous, mannerly, where the rules of society are highly influential on what people do, then this would be the kind of book for you. It's very much like that. So it's think Pride and Prejudice. You got it right here. Although it's got a different plot theme than Pride and Prejudice. It's much more similar to her book Emma than it really is to Pride and Prejudice. Okay, so Georgette Heyer's this is considered one of her best books. Okay, so let's talk about the plot. This is going to be a little bit more involved in a plot because really it's all the tangled relationships. I mean, they start out all sorts of tangled up, and Sophia, our main character, comes along and kind of is like, this won't do, and starts meddling to straighten everything up so that everybody ends up happily ever after with a person who suits them. And it is funny how it turns out, of course. So you start out with Sophia shows up at her aunt's home, and her love interest, so to speak, is her cousin Charles. And that can be a little awkward I don't know whether it was less awkward 50 years ago, 70 years ago when this was written, but it seems really weird that she picked to have cousins be the main love interest. But, I guess it's true that a lot of Regency English people would marry their cousins, so maybe it's not unrealistic, even if it's kind of a little weird. But anyway, regardless. So Sophia is very wealthy. She is the only daughter of somebody who's very wealthy, and she is kind of used to getting her own way. It's almost a little bit feminist in a way of her coming in and doing things that are a little bit shocking to the people around her that the society around her wouldn't normally do. But she can get away with it. The author does a great job of giving her a background that allows her to get away with this, because she is not familiar, so to speak, with the British society. She spent most of her time in Europe, going from Paris and Portugal and Vienna and all sorts of places in Europe to all sorts of high society, like she's friends with royals kind of thing. Being in charge of her father's household in a way that she expects to be able to, for example, buy her own horse and carriage and not have somebody buy it for her. She expects to be able to go in and do her own banking, even if, everybody in England is all like, a woman in a bank? That's dreadfully scandalous. But she's just like, I could do that because I've done it before. And so because of the background the author gives her, it doesn't feel shockingly, horribly out of place for her to be a little bit stronger woman than her contemporaries. Anyway, that's getting into character. Back to the plot. So Sophie shows up to the household of Charles, her aunt, her cousins. So Charles has several younger siblings, the most prominent being Cecilia, who is just coming on the marriage market, so to speak, and a brother who's a little mischievous. So she comes in and she sees that Charles is engaged to somebody and Cecilia is in love with somebody that's not appropriate, and so on and so forth. And she's like, oh my goodness, I must do something about this. And so in the course of events, she's trying to get certain people together and separate other people, and very subtly. This isn't, create a scandal or whatever. She's mostly trying to do it subtly. Like here, for Cecilia, for example, she's really in love with a poet who is not practical and doesn't have the means to support a wife. And Sophie doesn't have any real objection to the man, but really has an objection to the marriage. And she looks at Cecilia and says, Cecilia fell in love with his looks and the fact that he wrote poetry to her eyes, but isn't really looking at this in a practical aspect. And she didn't think that Cecilia would actually like to be married to him for a length of time. He wouldn't do the things that she would hope that he would do. For example, it's raining out and they're walking along. Will she call a cab, a horse and carriage, a buggy, for them to get out of the rain? Or will he just never cross his mind? And this poet, it would never cross his mind. He'd be thinking poetic thoughts about her in the rain and not thinking that she's getting soaked and is miserable. And so Sophie thinks this just isn't going to be a good marriage. So she actually pushes them together to have a lot of time spent with each other. So Cecilia sees who he actually is and kind of starts to grow tired of the fact that he's never interested in her. All he's interested in is his poetry. And maybe she is a muse, but isn't actually wife material, so to speak. So that's one of her schemes. Get a whole bunch together and discover that you really don't want to be together, and how that all falls apart. And so anyway, she does some things that are humorous and scheming too. The end of this book is hilarious, like very hilarious. The humor in this book is great. It gets a little bit to ramp up, just like Emma would be, where it takes a little bit of time to get used to the language and how people talk to each other. But once you get into it, the humor is fantastic. Now, a lot of the humor is subtle, and I wanted to give you one example of it, just a short paragraph. I'll read aloud on page 71. So Sophie's proper name out in society, because they always call each other by their last names. So Charles is Mr. Rivenhall, and Sophie is Miss Staten Lacey. Okay. They are out, I should give background around this paragraph. So Charles and Sophie are out on a carriage ride to do some errands. So she had an errand first, and it took her like 20 minutes to get it done, and he waited in the carriage for her. And now they're on their way to his errand. He told her that he had some business to transact near St. Paul's, adding that he should not keep her waiting above 5 minutes. If this was a shaft aimed at the length of time she had spent in the bank, he missed his aim, for Sophia said in the most amiable way that she did not mind waiting. This was a much more successful shaft. Mr. Rivenhall began to think that in Miss Staten Lacey he had met an opponent to be reckoned with. Now obviously there is some humor there. They're zinging each other in that little paragraph, but it's subtle, right? It's not as shocking as it might be. They do have a lot of banter. This is a book filled with banter. Some of it's subtle though, and it's fun though to watch as our main character Sophie is spirited and cheerful and happy almost the entire book. She's just having a great time, and Charles is like pulling his hair out, frustrated with her, and it's funny. It's funny to see. Okay, So I will talk a little bit about the language in this book. It is that old-fashioned Regency era language having to do with high society in that era. And there's some things that I, had to scratch my head, and I looked up several words to figure out what it was, because there are some words that I honestly had never come across. For example, I don't know the differences of carriage types. I don't know about you, but I couldn't tell you what a phaeton carriage looked like. So I looked it up to see what the image was on my phone, because that's kind of, it's important for the story, because Miss Sophie wants one and Charles doesn't think she should have one because it just seems a little bit too racy, a little bit too difficult for a woman to handle. I'm not, and it may be a little improper, a little bit scandalous, but anyway, she wants one. And so I had to look it up because it is such a big part where they're arguing about this, whether she should get one or not, and she does get one. But things like that, where if you're not familiar with this type of story, you might have some difficulty and need to look some things up and going, what is that again? Anyway, so coming back to things I like would be the characters. There are a lot of the characters in there, and that would be something that can be a little bit difficult to keep track of, but the author does a pretty good job when a character has not been around in the story long enough, reintroducing the character to remind you who this is. Oh yes, that was the guy with the mumps. Right, I remember him. Or, oh, that was the guy that was engaged to so-and-so. Yeah, okay, I remember that guy. So anyway, there's lots of characters, but the author does a pretty good job of being able to identify who is who. There were a couple of characters with similar enough names and they weren't in the story enough that I was kind of like, which one is that one again? But not very many. Anyway, the characters were a very strong point in this book, though. The character of Sophia I really, really liked. She was just a great character. I liked being around her. I liked her motives. I liked what she did. There were some surprises on things that she did that I thought were clever. She's just the kind of person that you would kind of want to be around, to be a friend with. So it was fun to spend a book with this character. She's pretty much the main character. Charles, her love interest, is also an interesting character, a little bit more like, a little more aloof, a little bit more stoic sometimes, and sometimes he just loses his temper, but he doesn't lose his temper in a way that's uncomfortable for a reader, like he's gonna hit somebody or anything. He's just like, I cannot believe you did that. You could feel the frustration and why he's angry, because he's protective of the people under his charge, whether it is Sophia or one of his sisters or his brother, his mom, his engaged fiance, whoever. Usually he loses his temper because of he's feeling protective about the people under him, and that's a good reason to lose your temper. In the way that he does it too is not obnoxious. So he is a character I liked. So again, I just like the characters. Cecilia, she made some foolish choices, but you can see her logic. The author did a good job of following, this is why she did the things she did, and why she feels stuck where she's at, and stuff. The younger brother, I didn't relate to at all, but I didn't dislike him. Like, the choices he made were poor, but he didn't make, he seemed to learn from those choices. You could really see him kind of growing as a character. So I thought they did a good job with the characters. Like I said, the humor was great. I was snickering at the end of the book. So it was bedtime, and I had, 50 pages left to go or something, and I'm like, no, I need to finish this. It's so funny, the ending. And so I was like giggling to myself until the end and stayed up way too late to finish it, because I was really, really into the story at that point. So it was really good. Let's see. Dislikes. There's very little I disliked. The language could be a little hard, like I mentioned. The number of characters, the fact that there were cousins getting married. These are the handful of things that I didn't like. I will mention in this book that there are some phrases that can be construed as anti-Semitic. Now, I didn't catch this on reading this book until it was pointed out to me. And that's partially, all right, there's two reasons that could be. One is because I'm not anti-Semitic. So if somebody is a bad character, but they're described as Jewish, it doesn't strike me as anti-Semitic because I'm just like, well, it'd be the same thing if they were Irish or, I don't know, Portuguese or something. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just a descriptive. It's not saying that I think all Jewish people are evil, slimy people or something like that. So partially it could be that. Partially, however, I do know that, and I'm not sure if this is, but there is a version of the Grand Sophy that had a couple of phrases edited in one edition of the book to try and reduce some of the anti-Semitic language. I don't know. If so, there would be like 3 phrases in the entire book that could be offensive, depending on the edition you got. So, I mean, I would say it's a product both of the time it was written, unfortunately. So Georgette Heyer may have been anti-Semitic. I don't know. It could also be a reflection of the time it was supposed to take place in, which I would believe would be anti-Semitic. Having said that, though, there's some negative connotations towards Methodists. And so, I don't say that, either she or the time were anti-Methodist, probably. So that's kind of, I don't know. It may just have been she needed somebody to be a slimy person for one scene, and she picked this person, and maybe, modern sensibilities, she should have picked something else. But I just need to point that out because some people can be very sensitive about that, and I certainly don't approve of anti-Semitism, so I'm going to say something in case that bothers you. If you can't get past it, don't read it. But as far as I'm aware, her other books, I don't think, I'm not aware that had that problem. So you could just pick another book by this author, and it would probably be just as hilarious and fun and enjoyable. So as far as the romance goes, this is another thing I like about this book. Okay, this to me felt like a real romance, not a modern romance that are usually full of lust. Like, there was nothing lustful in this book. There was nothing spicy at all. The closest you get is at the very, very, very end, practically the last sentence of the book, Sophie and Charles kiss. And that's it. There is nothing in this except for, maybe saying that somebody looks, are beautiful, but you don't get anything that's a physical attraction. And I really liked that because it seems like modern romances, it's all about the physical attraction. It has nothing to do with anything else. And this has everything to do with like a genuine respect and love towards somebody where you're like, I like that person and want to be around them. I could see them being part of my life for the rest of my life, not something where it's like, wow, I want to get in bed with that person, therefore I should, that's all that matters. Because that seems to be a really weird way to measure whether you want to marry somebody or not. So I really liked the romance part. But like I said, it doesn't feel like a romance novel because the modern romances really just aren't written that way. So it's much more, it feels in tone, much more similar to a modern historical fiction. So that would be, like if I were to classify it today, I'm not even sure I would classify it as a romance. It's almost Shakespearean with the tangled, it's kind of like, what was the one, I can't remember the Shakespearean one where it was like a whole bunch of different couples and they were trying to figure out who was paired with who. Anyway, doesn't matter. But, yeah. So that's the last I will say about that, I guess. Overall, loved the book. Absolutely loved it. I definitely want to read more of her stuff, and I probably will. So I give this a big 2 thumbs up. Highly recommended. If you're interested at all in historical fiction or romance, comedy, good banter type of books with lots of history kind of vein to it, highly recommended. I think you would love it. Okay, on to part 2. I'm going to read next a nonfiction. Failure is Not an Option by Gene Kranz. So this is the book about about the space program. So he was the director during Apollo 13. If you would probably recognize him based on the Apollo 13 movie. This is the guy that was the head of the director of Houston's, situation. And I think this deals with this. It says mission control from Mercury to Apollo 13 and beyond. So I think it's not specifically focused just on Apollo 13, but that's a huge part of the story. So it's going to be the space program and all the little things that went wrong, went right, whatever, during the height of NASA's big push to go to the moon, and as it slowly tapered off after that to more obscurity. But I think that would be a fascinating slice of history from an insider to read. So that's what I'm going to do next, and I hope you will join me. Thank you for watching.